Hey everyone! By the end of this video, you will know what cycles are in Integromat and how to work with them. My name is Dominik Lehnert. Let's get right into it. So the way cycles work is whenever you have a scenario in Integromat, this scenario, if you run the scenario once, you can have multiple cycles in it. And how does this work? So when you run a scenario in Integromat, in the beginning, you have the initialization period. What happens in this initialization period, difficult word, is that it checks all the modules and it checks if all the settings are there. Does Integromat have all the inputs it needs? And it kind of checks roughly, can I start the scenario? Is it going to break down immediately or not? So that is the initialization period. The next period after that is it starts a cycle. And a cycle is consists of two different things. So a cycle consists of an operations period and then of a commit and rollback period. So an operations period is basically read and write operations. So it's, for example, if you have set up a watcher that checks if there's new files uploaded into a Dropbox, this is kind of a read operation. So it's going to check, oh, did a new file get uploaded into my Dropbox folder that I'm watching. And then a write operation would be, it then maybe does something with the information and then it writes an update, or it adds a new row into a Google Sheet. So these are the read and write operations. And at the end of every cycle, there's a rollback or commit. So at the end of every cycle, it's going to check all the modules that are part of my scenario. So all the modules that have run, have they run successfully? And only if all the modules in the cycle, all the modules in the scenario have run successfully in this cycle, then it is going to commit the changes. And it's basically going to save what you did. But if even just one of these modules has failed to execute successfully, it's going to attempt a rollback. And if you are not familiar with relational databases, we're talking about the asset principle here. So basically what Integromat is trying to do is it's trying to check, is everything that I need to do to execute this task, this scenario, was it all successful, or basically, is it all going to be successful? And I only want to commit all the changes. I want to do all the changes. I want to add all the rows if the changes have actually been successful. And if not, I don't want to do any changes. So the way this works, for example, is if you work with Google Sheets and it has a little asset tag, we're going to look at that in Integromat in a second. If it has the asset tag, that basically means you can roll back the changes if something goes wrong. So if you add a row to a Google Sheet and it has the asset tag, that means if something else goes wrong in the scenario, then you might not want to add the row somewhere into a Google Sheet in the middle of the scenario, but you want to undo that because the other thing that also needed to happen didn't work out. So you can then delete the row and it is as if nothing happened. That's the rollback, basically. But not everything can be rolled back. Very simple example would be if you send an email. So if you have a scenario, you have a trigger in the beginning, something happens, and then you send an email, something else happens, and then and one of the later modules fails, then you cannot roll back the email you already sent. If you send out the email, it's out. It's already sent out. You can't undo that. And some of you might now argue that, okay, you could set a delayed trigger for the email. So it waits X amount of seconds until it actually sends out the email. So you cancel the send out process, basically, if something goes wrong later in the scenario. But also that's not really true, I would say, because then it's kind of arbitrary. If the scenario takes longer than the time you delayed the email with, then you can't actually roll it back. So you can't roll back an email. That's the point. So after you've run one cycle, so you basically ran the scenario once, you executed the modules, everything has been successful, and all the changes have been committed. Then the next cycle occurs. You do some operations, read some stuff, do something with the information in the workflow, basically, and then you write it somewhere. And then you again roll back or commit the changes, and then you can basically have as many cycles in there as you want. And then in the end, you have a finalization period. In this finalization stage, basically all it does is closes down all the connections. So all the connections it built up to databases and stuff like that, it's going to close down the connections because the scenario is now done. So So if we go over to Integromat and have a look at what this looks like, then this is a very simple scenario example. So we have 3 modules in here. We have one webhook sitting in the beginning as the trigger. And if we want to differentiate between scenario runs and webhook runs, we can look at the webhook. Scenario runs and cycles. We can look at the webhook. So each webhook can be triggered basically however many times you want. And as you can see here, it stores the amount of triggers it has received. So this webhook has received 3 triggers that are in the queue. And if I would now run the scenario, so if I go back over to my demo scenario, if I would click the run once button here, the scenario itself would be executed once, but we would have 3 cycles because we have 3 triggers stored in the queue. So all the elements, all the modules here would run 3 times with 1 scenario execution. Then 1 or 2 things you want to be aware of with one thing you want to be aware of with the cycles and scenario runs is that if you use basically the public Integromat version, so you don't have a private server where you run your own Integromat version, but you just use the plain old web application Integromat, then you have a limited time for the time that your scenario can run. So each scenario can only run 45 minutes. So the way you can actually do that, if you have a lot of cycles in a scenario, and let's say each cycle takes 5 minutes to execute. So running through the whole thing, executing all modules, committing it, everything takes 10 minutes, and you want to process 15 triggers, so 15 cycles, then you might want to break it up, and you can actually break up the amount. So if you have a trigger and it's set to, it's scheduled for regular intervals, then you can set how many cycles run with each execution. So if you set, for example, if you have 20 triggers in the queue and you set the execution, the number of cycles per execution to 5, this means there's going to be 4 total executions. So it's going to start the whole process from beginning, doing the initialization and everything 4 times, and each time it's going to run 5 cycles. So if you know that your scenario is very slow, or it takes a long time to execute the whole scenario, you want to make sure that you set the number of cycles per execution per run, basically not too high, because otherwise you could run into the timeout with the execution. So this is cycles in Integromat explained. If you have any specific questions you are looking to get answers to, you can post them in the comments below. If you want to help me do these videos and help me stay caffeinated doing these videos, you can also buy me a coffee below if you want. And if you have a business and you're looking to discuss specific scenarios for your business, or you're looking to get into Integromat and develop, or have someone develop specific scenarios for you, you can also reach out to me, buy me a coffee. That allows me to put aside some time on my calendar and we can get together. I can answer all your questions and help you out. My name is Dominik Lehnert. Take care and goodbye.